I'm going to be talking to Dominic Eagleton, who's a senior campaigner at Global Witness in the UK, about a recently released report, Hydrogen's Hidden Emissions, and it deals with the Quest project in Alberta, Canada. So welcome to the interview, Dominic.
Hi, Markham. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Now, can you start, please, by giving us an overview of the report?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's good to kind of set out the broader context. Kind of why we looked into the Quest project, and I think your viewers will probably be aware that there is a quite a heavy push from industry to kind of subsidize and deploy fossil hydrogen produced with carbon capture and storage as a tool to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. And currently, at the moment, there's only around, according to the IEA, around 700,000 tons of fossil hydrogen produced, with using carbon capture and storage. And the IEA suggests this needs to increase, like exponentially, up to 200 million tons per year. So we thought it would be important to kind of have a look and see, how, there's only currently, like I say, currently very small number of projects that are actually doing this at the moment. So we thought it would be instructive to, to kind of have a closer look at the project and see how well it was performing in terms of its, its climate profile.
Okay, let's get into that a little bit, because part of your report criticized the project for emitting more than it captured, and it's and you set out a standard of, you said the industry claims that with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, it'll get to 90% or better on these blue hydrogen projects. The problem is that when the Quest project was engineered, it was only designed to capture 33% of emissions, and now captures 48%. So if the design standards are 33%, I'm not sure how you can criticize it for not meeting the 90% threshold. It's like you're mixing up apples and oranges here.
Yeah, so yeah, sure, happy to explain on that. So yes, the 33% figure actually is applicable to the refinery as a whole, the Scotford refinery in Alberta as a whole. And what we wanted to do was look at the emissions profile just of the hydrogen production, just to isolate that, because obviously that's important for going forward, looking with a kind of this kind of big expansion of fossil hydrogen being advocated. So we thought it'd be important just to look at the emissions from the fossil hydrogen plant. And yes, that's absolutely correct. In fact, on its own terms, it's performing how Shell said it would, which it aimed to capture 1 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. But what, of course, what's not mentioned in Shell's kind of promotional materials on Quest is the proportion of emissions that are actually released into the atmosphere. So so it's fine. It's saying yes, 5 million tons of carbon dioxide captured within a space of 5 or less than 5 years, actually. But nowhere in the materials does it sort of mention what the proportion of emissions that went into the air. So that's where we thought we would come in and do some analysis on this, which is it's based on Shell's own some of it's the partial data that Shell publishes, but also from the Pembina Institute, which has looked at the life cycle emissions of the plant.
But isn't it implied, like if Shell says we're going to capture 1/3 of the emissions that are being generated by these three hydrogen, what are they called? The equipment that produces the hydrogen that is part of the upgrade. We'll get to that in a minute. But if they say we're only going to capture 33%, then it's implied that 67% isn't going to be captured and will be vented to the atmosphere. So I'm not sure how that's a criticism of the project.
Yeah, well, just to explain again, that the 33% referred to there is from the refinery as a whole. And so we wanted to just look at to isolate the emissions that are relevant just to the hydrogen production units within the refinery, because that's more relevant to hydrogen production as a whole. And actually, you know, the 48% figure, I mean, you know, that has not been published before by Shell. And it was actually analysis from the Pembina Institute that, you know, they did a really good job of kind of looking at the life cycle emissions. Actually, so not just the carbon dioxide that's emitted by the hydrogen production units within that plant. So again, just to say, we're just looking at the emissions within the hydrogen from the hydrogen production units. But of course, Pembina highlighted a really important aspect of hydrogen production from fossil gas, which is the methane emissions that also arise from, that are generated by hydrogen production, because obviously fossil gas is the feedstock. So yeah, so just to make clear that yeah, the 33% is a kind of a separate from that's for the whole refinery, and the 48% is from the carbon dioxide that's produced by just the hydrogen plant. And of course, when you factor in as we show in our report, when you factor in the methane emissions as well, that capture rate actually comes down to only 39% of the life cycle emissions of the production process for hydrogen. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we did a good job of making that, you know, kind of very clear in the report that this is what we were kind of honing in on.
Well, Dominic, actually, I don't think you did make it clear. I found the report rather confusing on that particular issue, because what you're talking about is that it's not a refinery at all. It's an upgrader. It takes 225,000 barrels a day of diluted bitumen from the Alberta oil sands and upgrades it to synthetic crude oil. This is not a refinery. It's an upgrader, and it uses natural gas in 3 hydrogen manufacturing units to create gray hydrogen, which is part of the upgrading process. And so, fair enough, if you want to argue that, you know, that the natural gas that is used in those units comes with its own fugitive methane emissions in the life cycle, okay, that's fair enough. But again, I think we're mixing apples and oranges here. But and nevertheless, let's move on to the next question. And this is a lot of your report is talking about the bigger context of blue hydrogen production out of natural gas, steam methane reforming process. And the conclusion, I guess, is that we're supposed to infer is that this carbon capture and storage doesn't work very well for this, because look at what's happening over at Quest. And it's not a hydrogen plant. It's an upgrader that uses hydrogen in the process. And again, apples and oranges. And the way it was explained in the report is confusing for anybody who doesn't know this stuff. Anyway, so your response.
We do explain in the report that you know, we use the term refinery in a very sort of broad sense, which, you know, you often see that in the media, actually. You know, energy journalists using the term refinery to refer actually to the upgrader. So we did that just as a kind of a shorthand, because, you know, a lot of people don't know what an upgrader is, but essentially, you know, it refines it processes the bitumen, let's say. So yes, so yeah, I mean, you know, the argument that it's not kind of blue hydrogen, I mean, there's a few kind of, you know, points to sound that, which, you know, is that it's made from fossil gas, this hydrogen, and it's used to process the bitumen, and carbon capture equipment is applied to the hydrogen production units. So the Quest is applied to the hydrogen production units. So you have the steam methane reforming process happening, and that's what the carbon capture system is applied to. And of course, you know, steam methane reforming is the kind of traditionally how fossil hydrogen is produced, or grey hydrogen, if you like, is produced. And of course, you know, one of the things we're really highlighting in the report is that, I mean, you know, there are hundreds of fossil hydrogen plants around the world. They release around 600 million tons of greenhouse gases every year. So what we're kind of trying to show is that actually, trying to apply carbon capture and storage to these emissions potentially could be, kind of really not good for the climate, because it might only capture a fraction of these emissions. And we're saying this partly because there are alternatives, which, many elements of industry, policymakers, example, are pushing for, which of course, the renewable, from renewables basically. And one of the classic ones would be green hydrogen, actually, which could be used instead of grey hydrogen, for example, to process bitumen and turn it into synthetic crude.
Sure, except that electrolyzers that make green hydrogen are 3 times or 4 times as expensive as creating blue hydrogen. That's the problem right now. And I've interviewed experts who talk about blue hydrogen being a bridge, I guess, to green hydrogen, which is expected to be economic around 2030, or competitive, I guess we could say. And I guess the biggest problem I had with your this report, Dominic, is that there are problems with carbon capture and storage. They're perfectly legitimate criticisms that could be made. And there's the whole issue of the extent to which carbon capture and storage prolongs oil and gas assets, or it's invested to decarbonize those assets, which then electrification of transportation comes along and strands in the 2030s or 2040s. Is that a good use of public dollars and public policy? I mean, those are all legitimate questions, but this particular report, I don't think did a good job of tying all of that in. My opinion, viewers can read your report. I will link to it in our YouTube and they can come to their own conclusions, but thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Could I just come back on one point very quickly?
You may.
Which is you made a really good point about, electrolyzers being quite costly, but this is one of the things we didn't actually address in the report, so I think it's kind of really important, is that there is a really serious risk of stranded assets with blue hydrogen, because they're billion-dollar projects, which could, within 10 years, and they can take 10 years to build, 6 to 10 years, whatever it is. In 10 years' time, it looks like they're going to be outcompeted by green hydrogen. And so companies do risk having these huge assets on their books, which could be, very much kind of uneconomic. So I think that's another kind of key issue to be thinking about here. And the reason we think the emphasis should be on boosting renewables, including renewable hydrogen.
Fair enough. Thank you very much for this, Dominic.
Thank you, Markham. Appreciate it. Thank you.